In the winter of 2021, a trail maintenance crew working near the Upper Hoh River in Washington State's Olympic Peninsula ran into something that had no place on any map. They were clearing a section of trail that had been partially buried by a soil slump following a series of heavy rains, and when they pulled back a curtain of displaced earth and root matter along a basalt shelf, they found a gap in the rock roughly large enough to crawl through. One of the crew members had a headlamp. He went in about 30 feet before he stopped moving. What he saw in that chamber, lit only by the narrow beam of a $5 hardware store headlamp, would eventually bring archaeologists, geologists, botanists, and at least 2 specialists in pre-Columbian epigraphy to one of the wettest, most remote corners of the continental United States. The cave, which sits roughly 4 miles from the nearest maintained road, had been sealed behind that soil curtain for an estimated period that preliminary analysis placed between 300 and 900 years. Inside it, resting on cedar plank shelves and on the cave's natural stone floor, were 20 objects, not accidentally deposited, not washed in by flooding, arranged, deliberately, carefully, and apparently with great purpose, in a chamber where the temperature and humidity had been remarkably stable for centuries. Some of what was found there has been quietly published in specialty journals. Some has been contested by people who have never been within 2,000 miles of the Pacific Northwest. All of it is going to make you wonder who was really moving through the old-growth forests of this continent before the world we know began. If nobody told you this cave existed, that is not an oversight. Subscribe right now and stay with me for all 20 of these objects, because number 1 is the reason the lead researcher on this project said she would never look at this forest the same way again. Number 20 is the object that oriented everything else in the cave, because it was the largest and the first one the trail workers' headlamp found. It was a cedar plank, roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, that had been carved along its entire face with a continuous design. Cedar is not unusual in this part of the world. The coastal indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest have worked with cedar for thousands of years, and it is one of the few organic materials capable of surviving centuries in the damp conditions of western Washington. What was unusual was the design itself. It did not match the formal visual vocabularies of the Kino, the Maka, the Klallam, or any of the other nations whose traditional territories border the Hoh rainforest. The carved figures were representational in a way that specialists described as anomalous, showing a procession of human forms in profile, each carrying an object, moving in the same direction, arranged in a sequence that suggested either a narrative or a ceremonial protocol. The plank appeared to have functioned as a kind of threshold marker, placed deliberately at the inner edge of the cave's entrance chamber. Whatever was kept beyond it was meant to be preceded by this image. What that procession was commemorating is still unknown. Number 19 was a bundle of fibrous material, tightly wrapped in layers of what turned out to be treated bark cloth, a method of textile preparation associated in North America most closely with cultures of the Pacific Coast and Mesoamerica. When conservators carefully unwrapped it under laboratory conditions, they found inside a collection of long, thin bone implements, 7 in total, each about 6 inches in length, polished, smooth, and incised at one end, with a repeating geometric mark. The bone was identified through isotopic analysis as coming from a large marine mammal, most likely a gray whale. That alone is not surprising given the proximity of the Pacific coast. What was surprising was the incised mark, which did not resemble any known Northwest Coast decorative tradition, but did resemble, closely enough to make 3 researchers uncomfortable, a symbol found repeatedly in the archaeological record of coastal cultures in what is now northern Chile and southern Peru. The distance between the Hoh rainforest and the central Andean coast is approximately 6,000 miles. The resemblance may be coincidence. The people who found it do not think it is. Number 18 was a ceramic jar, and ceramic is not supposed to be here at all. The indigenous peoples of the Olympic Peninsula are not known for a ceramic tradition. The raw materials for fine pottery are not particularly abundant in this environment, and the cultures of the Pacific Northwest coast developed extraordinary traditions in wood, bone, shell, and fiber that largely made fired clay unnecessary. This jar was about 10 inches tall with a narrow neck and a slightly flared base. made from a tan-colored clay with a fine sand temper. Analysis of the clay matched it to a source in the Columbia River Plateau, roughly 200 miles to the southeast, in the territory of plateau cultures who did maintain ceramic traditions. But the jar's surface decoration was something else. It showed a negative space design of interlocking zigzag bands that archaeologists working on Columbia Plateau ceramics said they had never seen in that tradition. The design did, however, appear in the visual record of cultures from the Great Basin, further south and east still. Someone carried this object a very long way, through terrain that is not easy, and placed it in a cave in the middle of the most impenetrable rainforest on the continent. Number 17 was a coil of rope about 3 feet long, dried to a dark brown and brittle enough that conservators handled it with the same protocols they would use on ancient papyrus. The fibers were plant-based, and botanical analysis identified them as coming from yucca, a plant that does not grow within 500 miles of the Olympic Peninsula and is native to the arid southwest and northern Mexico. The braiding technique was complex, a 4-strand pattern that textile experts described as consistent with documented weaving traditions from the American Southwest, specifically from cultures of the Four Corners region. Whatever this rope had been used to bind or suspend has long since decomposed, but the rope itself remained, a thin line of fiber connecting this cave in the temperate rainforest to a desert environment thousands of miles away, carried here by someone who either traveled that distance themselves or was connected to people who did. Comment right now and tell me what you think was worth carrying a rope this far to leave in a cave. I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think is going on here. Number 16 was a flat disc of polished stone, about 7 inches in diameter and nearly an inch thick, made from a deep green serpentine. Serpentine is found in the geology of the Pacific Northwest, so the material itself is not impossible here. What was impossible, or at least very difficult to explain, was the object's decoration. Both faces of the disc had been engraved with radiating lines emanating from a central hole drilled clean through the stone, creating a wheel-like pattern. 15 lines on one face, 16 on the other. The central hole was beveled on both sides in a way that suggested it had been designed for a cord or spindle to pass through without abrasion. The archaeologists who examined it proposed 2 interpretations. The first was that it was a spindle whorl, a weight used in spinning fiber into thread, which would make it the largest and most elaborately decorated spindle whorl ever recovered from North America. The second interpretation, proposed by an astronomer who was shown photographs, was that the radiating line counts corresponded to the number of days in 2 successive phases of the Venus cycle, as recorded in Mesoamerican astronomical traditions. Both interpretations have been formally published. Neither has been conclusively proven. Number 15 was a small figurine, about 5 inches tall, carved from a single piece of ivory. Marine ivory is not unusual on the Olympic Peninsula, given the long history of sea mammal hunting among coastal peoples here. But this figurine was not carved in any style associated with the northwest coast. It depicted a standing human figure with arms held straight at its sides, legs pressed together, face looking directly forward, in a posture that specialists in Mesoamerican archaeology recognized immediately as consistent with the formal standing figure tradition in West Mexican ceramic art, particularly the shaft tomb figurines associated with cultures from Jalisco, Colima, and Nayarit, dating from roughly 300 BCE to 300 CE. The style is specific enough and distinctive enough that coincidence is a difficult argument to make. This carving either came from West Mexico or was made by someone who had spent enough time there to fully absorb a very particular artistic convention and reproduce it in ivory in a cave in a Washington rainforest. Number 14 was a bundle of dried plant material that a botanist spent 3 weeks identifying. The bundle contained 6 distinct species. 3 of them are native to the Pacific Northwest and were clearly collected locally. The other 3 are not. One was identified as dried coca leaf, native to the Andean slopes of South America, and not found naturally anywhere north of Colombia. One was identified as dried flower material from a species of morning glory native to southern Mexico, a species that contains psychoactive compounds and was used ceremonially by several Mesoamerican cultures. And one was a dried seed pod from a plant the botanist initially could not place at all, which subsequent analysis traced to the tropical lowlands of Central America. Someone assembled this bundle deliberately, mixing local materials with specimens that required either direct travel to or direct trade connections with at least 3 separate geographic regions in Latin America. This is not a coincidence of cross-contamination. This is curation. Number 13 is the object in this cave that generated the most internal disagreement among the research team, and that is saying something given everything else they found. It was a stone tablet, roughly 8 inches by 6 inches, made from a fine-grained gray slate, covered on both faces with incised symbols arranged in horizontal lines. The symbols were not pictographic. They were not clearly representational of any object or animal. They had the visual character of a writing system, with the variation in symbol shapes and the regularity of their arrangement suggesting a finite set of signs being combined according to consistent rules. No one on the team could read them. Copies of the photographs were sent to specialists in a dozen fields. 3 responses came back almost simultaneously from researchers working independently, all noting a resemblance to symbols in the undeciphered Rongorongo script of Easter Island, a Polynesian writing system whose origins and meaning remain unknown. The Hoh Rainforest and Easter Island are separated by the Pacific Ocean. The connection, if it is one, would require contact across one of the largest bodies of water on Earth. The researchers who made the comparison did not do so lightly. Subscribe right now if you're just finding this channel, because we still have 12 objects to go and we have not even gotten close to the most extraordinary thing in this cave. Number 12 was a carved wooden mask, about 14 inches tall, made from a single piece of red cedar. Cedar masks are deeply embedded in the cultural traditions of the Pacific Northwest coast, and at first glance, this one appeared to be within that tradition. But the more closely it was examined, the more it departed from it. The face was not rendered in any of the formal conventions of Northwest Coast art, with its characteristic split representation, ovoid forms, and highly structured use of positive and negative space. Instead, it showed a naturalistic human face with exaggerated features, wide-set eyes, a broad nose, and a mouth opened in what might be interpreted as speech or song. The interior of the mouth was painted in a pigment analysis identified as cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound used as a red pigment across many cultures, but associated most specifically in North America, with elite burial contexts in Mesoamerica and the American Southeast. The mask had no eye holes. It was not made to be worn. It was made to be seen. Number 11 was a piece of worked obsidian, but not the kind of worked obsidian that archaeologists find at Pacific Northwest sites. Obsidian tools are common in the archaeological record of the entire West Coast, because obsidian is a superior material for cutting edges and was widely traded. This piece was different. It had not been knapped into a tool. It had been ground and polished into a flat surface, roughly 4 inches by 3 inches, smooth enough to produce a faint reflection. Obsidian mirrors, polished rather than chipped, are known from one primary cultural context in North American archaeology, and that context is Aztec and pre-Aztec Mesoamerica, where obsidian mirrors called Tezcatl held profound ritual significance and were associated with divination and with the deity Tezcatlipoca. The obsidian in this piece was trace element analyzed and matched not to the Oregon or California sources typically represented in Northwest Coast trade goods, but to a deposit in central Mexico. Someone brought a Mexican obsidian mirror to a cave in the Hoh Rainforest. Leave a comment right now and tell me what you think they were doing with it. Number 10 brought the team's linguist into the project for the first time. It was a length of knotted cord about 2 feet long, made from a plant fiber that was identified as cotton, which does not grow in Washington state. Along its length were tied a series of pendant cords, each a different color, achieved through dyeing, and each tied with a different number and arrangement of knots. The team's linguist recognized the basic format immediately. This was a quipu, or at least something that closely resembled one, the knotted cord recording system used by the Inca Empire and its predecessors in the Andes to encode information. Quipu have been found at dozens of sites in Peru and Bolivia. They have occasionally been proposed to exist in North American contexts, but no confirmed example had ever been recovered north of Mexico before this. The analysis of what information this quipu-like object might encode is ongoing. What it encodes, if it encodes anything at all, remains unknown. But its presence here, made from cotton that had to travel thousands of miles, dyed in colors that required sophisticated dyeing knowledge, tied in a pattern that mirrors one of the most sophisticated recording systems in the ancient Americas, is extraordinary. Number 9 was a small pouch made from what analysis identified as the skin of a fish, stitched with plant fiber thread in a running stitch so fine it required a magnifying lens to examine properly. Inside the pouch were 34 small objects, each carved from a different material: shell, bone, wood, various stones, one piece that appeared to be worked amber. The materials came from at least 6 different ecological zones. The amber did not match any North American amber deposit and tentatively matched Baltic or Dominican sources, a comparison so improbable that the researcher who made it declined to publish it pending further analysis. The carved forms of the individual objects were abstract, each one roughly the same size but shaped differently, with no two identical. A mathematician on the team noted that 34 is a Fibonacci number, and that several of the carved forms, when arranged in ascending order of complexity, appeared to follow a geometric progression. She noted this observation formally and then added in the margins of her notes a question mark. Number 8 was a painted hide, roughly 2 feet square, made from the skin of an animal that was identified as a pronghorn antelope. Pronghorn live on the open grasslands east of the Cascades, not in a coastal rainforest, so this hide traveled at minimum 200 miles to get here. On its surface, painted in red, black, and a yellow ochre, was an image that the team spent days interpreting. It showed a central figure surrounded by radiating lines, with smaller figures arranged around the periphery. The central figure has been interpreted variously as a sun, as a deity figure, as a map of a river system, and as a representation of a spider's web. What all the interpreters agreed on was that the painting showed a relationship between a center and its periphery, and that the relationship was hierarchical, with the central figure dominant. This kind of cosmological diagram, showing a world organized around a central power, appears in religious art from cultures ranging from the American Southwest to the Valley of Mexico to the Pacific coast of South America. The artist who painted this hide was working in a visual tradition that connected them to a very large world. Number 7 was a copper bell, small enough to sit in the palm of a hand, cast in a mold rather than hammered, making it the only cast metal object in the cave. The technology of lost wax casting for copper bells was widespread in Mesoamerica, and was also present in cultures along the Pacific coast of South America. But it was not a technology practiced by the pre-contact peoples of the Pacific Northwest. This bell would have been produced somewhere else and carried here. The bell's tone, when struck by a conservator who could not resist, was clear and resonant. Its surface showed a stylized animal face, most likely a feline, rendered in a style that the Mesoamerican specialists on the team identified as consistent with traditions from West Mexico or perhaps Lower Central America. Copper bells of exactly this type have been found at sites in Arizona associated with the Hohokam culture, which maintained trade connections with Mesoamerica, and at a handful of sites in the American Southwest. This is the first one ever recovered from the Pacific Northwest coast region. Number 6 was a shell, but not a local one. It was a spondylus shell, the large, spiny oyster with a vivid orange-red interior that was among the most sacred and traded objects in the ancient Americas. Spondylus is native to the warm waters off the coast of Ecuador and northern Peru, and its trade network extended from South America up through Central America and into North America, carried thousands of miles from its source. It was used as currency, as ritual offering, as ornament, and as a marker of elite status across cultures that had no direct political connection, but shared a reverence for this specific object. Finding a spondylus shell in a cave in Washington state is not impossible. There is archaeological evidence for spondylus reaching the Pacific Northwest coast through long-distance exchange. What made this one unusual was its condition. It had not been worked into jewelry or ground into powder or broken for inlay. It was intact, placed on its natural curved base, and oriented toward the cave's interior. It had been placed there to be itself, not to be used for anything. It was an offering in its most complete and unreduced form. Number 5 was a textile, and it survived because it had been packed inside the ceramic jar from Object 18, sealed with a cedar stopper, and insulated from moisture for centuries. When conservators extracted it, they found a woven piece roughly 18 inches square, made from a fiber that was identified as a blend of cotton and something the textile specialist initially could not place. Further analysis identified the second fiber as silk, specifically a type of silk that does not come from the domestic silkworm of Asia, but from a wild silk moth native to Mexico, whose cocoons were harvested and processed by certain Mesoamerican cultures before European contact. The weaving pattern was a compound twill, one of the more complex weave structures in pre-industrial textile production, requiring a loom with multiple heddles to execute. The design woven into it showed a repeating geometric pattern in 2 colors, red and natural cream, a pattern that the textile specialist described as without close parallel in any documented North American weaving tradition, but sharing structural characteristics with weaving from coastal Peru. This textile is one of the most technically sophisticated pre-contact woven objects ever recovered north of Mexico. Number 4 was a carved stone vessel, squat and wide, about 8 inches across, made from a black volcanic stone that analysis identified as basalt from a source in what is now Oregon. The carving was technically demanding, hollowing out the hard basalt to a wall thickness of less than half an inch throughout, a feat that requires sustained effort and considerable skill. The exterior of the vessel was covered in low-relief carving, a series of interlocking serpent forms whose bodies wound around the full circumference of the vessel in a continuous band. Serpent imagery is widespread in pre-Columbian art across the Americas, but the specific style of these serpents, the way the scales were rendered, the treatment of the head, and the interlocking composition, matched most closely to serpent imagery from Oaxacan cultures in Mexico, specifically the Zapotec and Mixtec traditions that flourished in the first millennium CE. The interior of the vessel showed traces of a dark resinous residue that has been partially analyzed. It contained compounds consistent with copal, the tree resin burned as incense throughout Mesoamerica in ritual contexts. Someone burned copal in a carved stone vessel in a rainforest cave in Washington state. This is not a small claim, and the evidence for it is not ambiguous. Number 3 was a collection of painted wooden sticks, 11 of them, each about a foot long and about the diameter of a thumb. They had been bundled together with cord and then wrapped in bark to protect them. Each stick was painted with a unique combination of colored bands, red, black, yellow, and a deep blue made from a pigment the conservators identified as indigo, which does not grow in the Pacific Northwest. The painted patterns on the sticks were not random. When the mathematician on the team arranged them in order of the number of color bands on each, she found a sequence that encoded the first 11 triangular numbers. Triangular numbers are a class of figurate numbers known to ancient mathematical traditions in multiple cultures, represented by the number of dots that can form an equilateral triangle. 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, 21, 28, 36, 45, 55, 66. 11 triangular numbers, on 11 painted sticks, in a cave in a temperate rainforest, sealed away from the world for potentially 9 centuries. The mathematician who identified this did not make an announcement. She made the identification on a Thursday, went home, came back on Friday, and then checked her work 9 more times over the following 2 weeks before she told anyone. Number 2 was found at the back of the chamber, elevated on a natural stone shelf at roughly shoulder height, placed with a deliberateness that the whole team commented on separately in their field notes. It was a wooden box, roughly 14 inches long and 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, made from what appeared to be a single piece of wood that had been hollowed from the inside, with a fitted lid attached by means of a clever interlocking carved joint that required no adhesive or fastener. The wood was a tropical hardwood that does not grow in the Pacific Northwest, identified tentatively as a species native to Central America. The box's exterior was carved with interlocking geometric designs of a sophistication and precision that the woodworking specialists described as requiring years of training to produce. Inside the box, resting on a bed of the same fine plant fiber cordage found elsewhere in the cave, were a dozen small carved figurines, each about 2 inches tall, each representing a different animal. Among them were animals native to the Pacific Northwest, a salmon, a raven, an elk, and also animals that are not and never have been native to the Pacific Northwest. A jaguar, a tapir, what appeared to be a macaw, and one figure that no one on the team could definitively identify, a crouching animal with a long snout that reminded one researcher of a coati and another of a small bear, but matched neither perfectly. The box was a world in miniature, and the world it contained was not just this forest. And now we come to number 1. This is the object that the lead researcher described in her field notes, which I have read in full, as the thing that changed the entire framework through which she understood her work. It was found at the very deepest point in the cave, in a secondary chamber behind a natural stone partition that the team had to crawl through, in a space roughly 10 feet across and 6 feet high. In that space, centered on the floor, was a single object about 3 feet tall, carved from a single piece of stone, standing upright without any external support, placed on a flat natural stone base as if it had been there since the beginning of things. It was a stela. A carved stone pillar of the type that served as monuments and inscribed records in the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica and beyond. This one was carved on all 4 sides. The carving on 3 of the 4 sides showed figures and symbols that share visual elements with several pre-Columbian traditions, but cannot be definitively assigned to any one of them. The carving on the 4th side was different. It showed a sequence of symbols arranged in regular rows, dense and deliberate, covering nearly the entire face of the stone from top to bottom. The symbols were not the same as those on the slate tablet from Object 13. They were not the same as any other writing system in the cave. They appeared to be a third distinct system of notation, or possibly inscription, in this single underground chamber. 3 possible writing systems, in one cave, in a rainforest in Washington state. The lead researcher sat on the floor of that inner chamber for a long time after she first saw it, not because she had no questions, because she suddenly had too many. This stela is currently under active study by teams from 3 universities and 1 independent research institute. No findings have been formally published. A preliminary report is expected in the coming year. Whatever it says, whoever made it, whoever brought it here, and why they chose this particular forest and this particular cave, the world it implies is one we do not yet have words for. A world where people moved across this continent and across the oceans that border it with a freedom and a purpose that the history we learned does not account for. A world where knowledge was precious enough to carry thousands of miles and seal inside a mountain for someone else to find. For us to find. Maybe. Here is what I want to leave you with. Every object in this cave arrived here because someone chose to bring it. The cord from the desert Southwest. The coca leaves from South America. The obsidian mirror from Mexico, the textile with silk from a wild moth no one in Washington state would ever have seen, the stela at the back of the cave, covered in symbols we cannot yet read. None of these things ended up together by accident. Someone, or a succession of someones across time, was building something in that chamber. A collection, a record, a kind of library made not from paper but from the most durable things they could find and carry. The question of who they were is not one we can fully answer yet, but the question of what they were doing is, I think, something we can begin to understand. They were doing what humans have always done when they encounter knowledge that feels too large for one place or one lifetime. They were trying to save it. Drop a comment right now and tell me which object in this cave you think is the most significant, and why. Tell me what you think was in this cave that we have not yet figured out. I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to know what you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who thinks the story of this continent is settled and finished, and I will see you in the next one.